take it away.
Thanks, Michelle. Good morning, everyone. My name is Brenna Meneghini, and I am the lead of our non-disaster grant programs here in FEMA Region 10. And what that means is we work on the BRIC, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Grant, as well as the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, the FMA program. Today, I am joined here by McCormick, who is the FEMA Region 10 Planning Program Manager right now. And him and I are going to present on capability and capacity building under BRIC and planning application development. Next slide. All right, so if you're here today, you've probably seen our webinar schedule. We did the introduction to BRIC last week. Today we're doing our planning application development. And next week we'll be looking at project scoping. So hopefully you can join us for these, but again, if you're not able to, they will be recorded. Next slide. So just some basic housekeeping for today. Everyone is on mute, but we do want your questions, so please feel free to type in your questions into the Q&A or the chat, and we'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Throughout the presentation, we're also going to have some interactive knowledge checks. These are all anonymous, so don't feel that you have, if you have the wrong answer, that's going to look bad or anything. No, these are all anonymous. It's certainly okay, and we're all learning this together. If you have any technical issues today, go ahead and in the chat message Michelle, and she will help kind of work through any issues you might have. And hopefully you've found your participant panel today to see who else is on the line, as well as, find your chat panels and ask questions. All right, so today's agenda, we are talking about the BRIC program, so an overview of BRIC. We're going to be discussing the tribal mitigation planning process, what elements go into a hazard mitigation assistance plan application. We're going to do some wrap up and our resources. We're going to provide what resources are also out there, and then we'll do some general questions and answer at the end for any remaining questions. Next slide. All right, so the first question we have is a yes or no. So on your screen, you may hit the yes or the no. So does your tribe currently have a FEMA hazard mitigation, a FEMA approved hazard mitigation plan? Do you know? Perhaps your community doesn't, perhaps it does. Do you know if you have one in your tribal nation? And a couple that don't, so hopefully today with what you can learn about applying for a grant to write that hazard mitigation plan. All right, so now we're going to discuss a BRIC overview and the basics of the program. All right, so BRIC is a nationally competitive program. And what that means is every year a notice of funding opportunity and NOFO, it'll release to grants.gov. And this document outlines everything about the program, and it will outline things such as the funding availability that's available that 1 year, deadlines for applications. It'll list types of criteria for projects. So it's a really important document, and you definitely want to take a look at that if you have not already. So the BRIC program is a newly authorized program under the Disaster Reform Recovery Act of 2018, the DRRA. And if you're familiar with the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program, PDM, this program does replace this, the PDM program. BRIC replaces PDM. So the eligibility. So we're kind of unique here in that a federally recognized tribe can apply to FEMA as the grant applicant or the sub-grant applicant. So through a state as a sub-grantee or through a direct relationship with FEMA as the grant applicant. So to be eligible as a direct applicant, the tribe or village or the state they're located in must have received a major disaster declaration within the past 7 years. But something important to note with that is that as of spring 2020, with the coronavirus pandemic, all federally recognized tribes in our states all meet this definition because all of the states did receive a COVID declaration, and therefore all of the federally recognized tribes that have fallen within these states meet that definition as well. Next slide.
Actually, Brenna, if you could repeat that last part again. I think we lost you a little bit in the chat, but you were talking about the coronavirus affecting all 50 states, so that impacts eligibility.
Yes, because the coronavirus occurred in spring of 2020, there were major disaster declarations to all of the states. And so because of that, all of federally recognized tribes that fall within our states here in the United States, they're able to satisfy that criteria of receiving a major disaster declaration within the past 10 years. So don't let that seem fearful. As of that spring 2020, all states and federally recognized tribes meet that criteria.
Great, thanks for circling back to that.
No problem. All right, so what kind of funding is there available for BRIC this year for fiscal year 21? So there is $1 billion of funding available. And you'll see here how it's kind of split into these different buckets. So there's the state and territory allocations. Then we have the tribal set-aside. This is up to $25 million. And then we also have the national competition for projects. So any project over 1 million will go into this competition for mitigation projects, this national competition. And then these two here on the left side is what we're going to focus on mostly. So the state set-aside and the tribal set-aside are up to 1 million federal share. And within that amount of funding, there is different uses for that. And that's management costs, capability and capacity building activities, and mitigation projects. And today we're going to discuss planning, which is a part of capability and capacity building activities. So we're going to be talking about hazard mitigation planning. And it's really important to note here that capability and capacity building activities, which includes planning, it's only available in that tribal set-aside or state set-aside. So it does not go into the national competition, so you have to apply for it as part of your set-aside. Next slide. All right, so as we're talking about capability and capacity building activities, what does it mean? As we're specifically looking at the planning aspect. So as part of your set-aside, that $1 million federal share, only up to 500,000 federal share can be used towards planning and planning activities. So what do those activities include? So we have more traditional ideas here, like preparing a new hazard mitigation plan. Perhaps your community doesn't have one. Or perhaps you're looking to update your hazard mitigation plan because those are required to be updated every 5 years. So that is a portion of this. You could definitely apply for a new plan or perhaps that plan update. You could also do planning activities, such as enhancing a section of your current FEMA approved plan, or maybe integrate information from your mitigation plan, like your risk assessments or a strategy, into another planning effort, more like into a comprehensive plan or something like that. And then perhaps at the very end there, you'll see things like procuring of hazard identification or mapping related equipment in regards to implementing that mitigation planning related activity. But if you're here today and you don't have a hazard mitigation plan, you really want to focus there on getting a mitigation plan. You want to focus on preparing a new plan for your community as part of that tribal set-aside and BRIC capability and capacity building. Next slide. All right, so there is a cost share in our programs. So on the left side here, you're going to see our standard cost share. That's 75% federal, 25% local. So that federal share cannot exceed 75%, and that's really important. So it can't be 76%, it can't be 77%, it can't be more than that 75%. And then on the right of your screen here, you're going to see Economically Disadvantaged Rural Communities Cost Share, or EDRC. If you're familiar with the Small and Impoverished Cost Share, that is actually the same thing. The title has just been updated. So it is 90% federal and 10% local. And it's really important that you request this in your actual application, because if you request it after you submit your application, we can't change that. So it's important that you request it in your application. So what's the criteria to meet this cost share? And it is being a community of 3,000 individuals or fewer and being economically disadvantaged. And how FEMA defines that, and in the NOFO, it is having a per capita income of 80% or less of the national per capita income. So right now that hovers about $26,000, and if you're not able to find that for your community, definitely reach out to us at our contact at the end, and we'll be happy to try to see if we're able to locate that for you as well. But it's really important just to take away from the slide is that you have to request this in your application and provide that documentation in your application. So if you think you qualify, you definitely want to apply for that cost share, because we can't change it to the lower cost share after you've requested the 75%, 25% in an application. Next slide. So match. So you might be thinking, okay, what type of match sources can I start looking at for this grant? So first and foremost, in our applications, we do require match commitment letter. This can be from your tribal council, the tribal board, perhaps the president, and a tribal executive. And this is just to confirm that the tribe is committing to meet the match of the grant. And some potential match sources to think about is staff time. So this is one of our most common ones. Let's say you have someone with your application on your staff, them closely tracking their time, and then perhaps, after that grant is awarded, they are working on either writing the hazard mitigation plan themselves, or perhaps they're working on that project management aspect of it. They're coordinating meetings, things like that. They can use their time as match. So it's really important to start documenting those things up front. Then there's also volunteer time, or what we call in-kind donations. So perhaps you're using, you're gathering data from community elders, and you're using volunteers, whether in the community or staff, just to, get some of that information data from elders. That could be something that actually, again, you really want to make sure you're carefully documenting that match time, and you're tracking it by the number of hours, hourly rate, donated by the individual, things like that. We also have a hazard mitigation assistance cost share guide, which goes into a lot more specifics. So you can follow that link later on if you have time to take a look at some other opportunities for match. Next slide. So now I'm going to hand it over to Kyle McCormick, who is based in our Idaho office, and he's going to talk about the tribal nations planning benefit in the process. Kyle, over to you.
Awesome, thanks, Brenna. Again, my name is Kyle McCormick. I'm a mitigation planner here in FEMA Region 10. And over the next few minutes, I'm going to discuss the benefits and processes of developing a hazard mitigation plan. I really wanted to highlight some of the benefits of going through the planning process, and hopefully this will help, especially as you start to scope out your own planning process and writing your planning grant scope of work. I like to think of the mitigation plan really as a blueprint for community resilience. This is your opportunity to build a vision of where you want to be with big but attainable goals. One second here. And so there are many different benefits of going through a robust planning process. And having a hazard mitigation plan really helps your community prepare before a disaster and positions you to recover more quickly after a disaster, because the hazards, capabilities, and mitigation actions are documented and ready to be acted on. And again, mitigation planning builds partnerships across tribal communities. by maximizing opportunities to share information and resources towards achieving those disaster resilience goals. And through this process, defining goals, it ensures that other community priorities from, say, your community development plan or your natural cultural resources preservation plan are also protected from the impacts of natural disasters. The planning process itself can expand the resources as well of a tribe, whether it's a structural mitigation project, enacting an ordinance or building code, or preserving the natural functions of open space. It can really help you leverage a wide range of resources and fully utilize FEMA's funding programs. Through this process, you'll be able to really focus on community assets that are most at risk and prioritize projects that will proactively address their impacts. While at the same time, you'll be increasing the awareness in your community of these hazards through specific community engagement that you do through the planning process. Next slide. All right, and so through the mitigation plan, again, you are really able to build partnership with community leaders that have an interest in the mitigation strategy, and those who may be able to provide tools, resources, and data or expertise that will help inform the plan. Partnerships are such an important aspect of our work in emergency management. Nothing can be accomplished alone, and so going through this process of identifying risk and mitigation strategies can really bring people together and strengthen existing relationships or build new ones. So through this process, you'll be able to identify complementary plans that you can align goals and priorities with, such as the comprehensive or land use plan, where you can decide how to develop your community in a way that places critical infrastructure and new development out of harm's way. And so when you're thinking about building a planning team to help you create or update your mitigation plan, consider reaching out to some of the folks in your community with the titles you see on the slide, such as a tribal official or a tribal counselor, tribal planners. These individuals will have an in-depth knowledge about your priorities in the community and can be a great partner for helping you assess your risk, understand the capabilities in your community, and help develop a realistic mitigation strategy. Also think about even business leaders in your community. Bringing in business leaders to the table can give them a voice for developing strategies that will help avoid impacts and losses to your community in the business and economic sector so that you can recover more quickly after the event. All these partners listed here are really great ideas for you to engage through the planning process as a way to build partnerships with them and really think about ways that you can leverage each other's resources in a way that meets your community priorities. Again, these are really great ideas, especially as you start to develop a scope of work or thinking about updating your mitigation plan or starting a new mitigation plan for partners that you want to bring to the table. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the core principles of planning is giving the community an opportunity to participate in the development of the plan to ensure that the plan reflects community priorities. Tribal leaders, businesses, and families and individuals all have different priorities and are impacted by natural disasters in different ways. Through your plan update, you can leverage the process to really engage your community through public meetings, public surveys, or other types of fun public events to really understand these priorities and utilize the information to develop tailored mitigation strategies that benefit the whole community. And through this process, you can really understand any of those shared desires from your whole community. As you can kind of see from the slide, you can see many different types of people in your community, types of agencies will have shared wants and desires. And so identifying these is a really great way to identify shared objectives and ensure that the plan is supported by everyone. All right, next slide. Okay, and so one of the main benefits of the mitigation planning process is that you will be able to build a prioritized list of actions that will help you turn your blueprint into reality. And again, we all know that since there's a limited amount of time, resources, money, funding available, the planning process really helps your community identify what you want and need to prioritize based on what's most important to you, and also what might cause the most impact from a hazard, and what you'll be gaining the most benefit from doing. And you can see from the example provided here that there are still a few community assets, such as the school, mercantile, and community center, that still appear to be at risk from things like flooding, coastal erosion potentially. And so going through the planning process will help this community really understand which buildings they may need to prioritize moving first, based on the information they gathered through community input, detailed risk assessments, and the potential costs versus benefits. While all these structures are definitely important to the community, they can go through this planning process to understand which they may need to prioritize and develop a strategic action plan for ensuring that their community assets are safeguarded. The next slide. I see a couple things in the chat. Is everybody hearing me okay? Or is it still a little choppy?
I'm seeing you come through fairly clear now. You had a quick chop moment, but.
Okay. So this next slide really goes through the planning process, and we could spend, a lot of time going through this mitigation planning process. And really, this is a really great way to look at it is by breaking it down into these 7 different steps. And we also have a really helpful tribal mitigation planning guidebook that can help you every step of the way through this process. And we can potentially share it after this presentation with the folks here. And so the mitigation planning process will really take you through a process to identify your hazards and understand how they will impact those important systems in your community, such as economic systems or the natural and built environment. You'll also be able to. Awesome. Yeah, and so again, you really start your mitigation planning process by identifying the partners you want to bring to the table, really what your planning area is. And you go through this process to really identify any important community assets that may be vulnerable to community or to the hazards that affect your the hazards and their potential impacts on your community by looking at things like past hazard events and how they impacted your community. And also that help you change due to climate conditions or development in demographic patterns. And through this step number 2, you'll really start to understand natural hazards and move into what you want to do to reduce those risks. And so that next step number 4 and step number 5, will help you develop the mitigation strategy. The mitigation strategy is really the heart of the mitigation plan. All of the information that you gathered through the risk assessment and public engagement will inform which projects you want to accomplish and how you will prioritize those projects. And then in steps 6 and 7, you'll really start to build a process for keeping track of your progress and how you plan to keep the plan updated so that it doesn't expire. And what's not on this list is really the final step is getting your plan officially adopted by the community leadership. And then once you do that, you can really start working on implementing those projects that you've identified within the plan. It's really important here to remember that the more time you take developing a robust process to create the plan, starting with your planning grant scope of work, the more effective your community will be in creating real change through these mitigation actions. And the planning process and the path you take to develop the plan really is more important than the plan itself. We always tell the folks that we work with that the planning process is more important than the end document. because the planning process will take you through this process to really build partnerships and identify where you can really make the most impact. Next slide. All right, so a couple of key important requirements and regulations related to tribal mitigation plans. Number one is the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000. And so in the year 2000, Congress officially recognized that disaster protection starts with a mitigation plan. And to address those escalating disaster costs, Congress passed this act. And specifically, the Stafford Act requires states, tribes, territories, and local governments to develop and adopt a FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plan as a condition for receiving certain types of non-emergency disaster assistance, such as the hazard mitigation assistance grants like BRIC and HMGP. And so you have to, this really established that you have to develop a hazard mitigation plan in order to be eligible for these mitigation grants. And so to go along with this act, new requirements were published in what's called the Code of Federal Regulations, or the CFR, for what's required to be within that mitigation plan. And we've developed these really helpful guides called the Tribal Mitigation Plan Review Guides that really walk through each of those requirements and what needs to be located within that plan. And this will actually help you walk through it, and as you're developing a scope of work for a planning grant application, you can really walk through this to understand what you'll be required to do to make sure your plan is approvable by FEMA. A couple other important things here is that the plans are on 5-year life cycles, and so you have to make sure that you update your plan every 5 years to maintain eligibility. And then next slide. All right, I believe this is our first knowledge check. And the poll question is, a mitigation plan must be updated every blank years to maintain eligibility for certain FEMA grants. So go ahead and mark your answer there and hit submit. We'll make sure that this sticks in your brain. It looks like there's about another minute to answer this question. Awesome. Awesome, yeah, so it looks like everybody was able to get that one right. And again, the answer there is 5 years. The mitigation plan must be updated every 5 years to maintain eligibility for certain FEMA grants. All right, thanks, and I will pass it back to Brenna to go over the genetic planning application limits.
Thanks, Kyle. Okay, so now we kind of learned some of those benefits from developing a hazard mitigation plan. And now we're going to talk about what goes into a planning application. So getting funding to write that hazard mitigation plan. So here on your screen, you're going to see what's required in an application. So there's several things that are required, such as a scope of work. We need to know, what is your plan going to address? Is it an update? Is it a new plan? Is it going to address deficiencies of the old plan? What type of risk assessment are you doing? Are you running HAZIS? Are you using, records from existing risk assessments, perhaps some county data? What kind of information are you using? Then we have a schedule. How are you going to actually do this mitigation plan? How long is it going to take you? Our grants have a standard period of performance of 36 months, so 3 years. How are you going to accomplish this plan in that schedule? And then the cost estimate and budget. So the actual cost to do this plan, the items that will make up the plan, to the expenses essentially to conduct this plan and write it. And then all of those kind of make up that planning application. Next slide. So what goes into your scope of work? So your scope of work has to be a detailed explanation of the planning activity. So what kind of milestones will there be? And what's the deliverable? Are you going to have a FEMA approved hazard mitigation plan? Are you incorporating mitigation risk assessment information from the mitigation plan into another plan? What is that deliverable from this sub-grant? And then the scope of work has to describe details of that planning activity and how it'll be conducted. So who's part of that hazard mitigation plan? Is it a staff, existing staff, a team of 5 that will be working on it? Who's performing that work? Is it tribal staff? Are you hiring a contractor or consultant to write the plan? And then what's that, again, that proposed activity? Is it a new plan? Is that a plan update? Is it a section that's going to be revised? Is it just incorporating information from one portion into another plan? And then from there, what are those timelines and milestones that need to be kind of worked out to make sure that your actual scope of work is accomplished? Next slide. So the following elements you see here, these are elements that must be included in your scope of work. And where they are, we're telling, that these are required, these are found in the 2015 Hazard Mitigation Assistance Guidance. So if we're going to go into these today, but if you have any more questions, the HMA guidance really goes into the various details explicitly about each one of these areas. So the first area that must be included in your scope of work is the planning area, the planning process, the previous mitigation planning, so has a mitigation plan been done before, available data and risk assessment process, development of the mitigation strategy, and then the final, that mitigation plan adoption. How is that going to be done? Next slide. So the application work schedule and tasks. So we want to see a work schedule in your application, and we want to make sure it's realistic, right? So we want to see a timeline of all the tasks that are noted in your scope of work. So for example, let's say you put that you're going to hire a contractor, but you're in your scope of work, but your schedule has nothing about that. It's just, one line, write the plan, get it adopted. We want to make sure that each task that you're discussing in your scope of work is attributed to that in that schedule. So we want to see that each task is accounted for that's needing to be achieved to receive that FEMA approved plan. So are you going to be, procuring contractors? Are you going to form a planning committee? Does one already exist? What kind of items need to be accomplished to make sure that you can complete this hazard mitigation plan? We also recommend you include times for review or revisions for your hazard mitigation plan. And this is because your hazard mitigation plan will have to be reviewed by our FEMA planners prior to receiving that FEMA approval. So we always recommend including about 6 months. In this way, if you have any revisions needed, that you give yourself a large enough buffer to get those revisions completed. And then we also want to include that final deliverable, right? So what is that final deliverable? Like your new plan, so it is an updated plan, and you have it FEMA approved, it's been adopted by council. We want to see those kind of tasks aligned with the schedule. And then the last little note there, we want to make sure that timeline is reasonable and reflective of that scope of work. So if you have a really, really robust scope of work with a lot of details, and then your timeline is, maybe 1 or 2 items, it doesn't look necessarily reasonable because you haven't necessarily shown us how you're going to accomplish all in the scope of work by giving a limited schedule and timeline. So you want to make sure that they're both reflective of each other. Next slide. All right, so here on your screen, you're going to see kind of a sample schedule. And this is in the FEMA Go, FEMA Grant Outcomes system, where our BRIC applications are required to be submitted. So you can see here the task, the first task listed is procure a consultant. That first month, they're going to look at doing that, and then it only takes a month for them to complete. You know, they're hiring a consultant to, maybe through an RFP, to hire that consultant to write that plan or perhaps do other portions of the plan. And then as you follow the tasks on the left side below, you'll see, you know, they're developing plan and community input, they're drafting the plan, they're submitting the plan to FEMA, they're finalizing that hazard mitigation plan, and they're acquiring the final proofs and edits, and they've also included time to educate the community, which is a great example here. They've provided some time to perhaps, you know, circulate that mitigation plan through the community. And then that very last bullet there, you'll see they've included time to close out the grant. Because once that hazard mitigation plan is approved, that's fantastic, but the grant also needs to be closed out, and final reports do need to be submitted. So this is a great example of the schedule. Somebody's really walked through it and thought out each task they need to do, and then when they'll start that task, so what month within the grant, and then how long it takes them. So for example, you'll see that finalized H&P. They would finish finalizing that at the 21st month, but it takes them 2 months to do. So they're maybe going through doing final edits, things like that. Next slide. All right, so now we're going to do another knowledge check. So on your screen, you should see the question, which of this is not a scope of work planning element? So not. The planning area, planning process, previous mitigation planning, developing management costs, available data and risk assessment process, development of a mitigation strategy, or plan adoption. So go ahead and take a minute and think of which one of those is not a scope of work planning element, and choose your answer. Remember, these are the elements in the 2015 hazard mitigation guidance that states what's required in a planning application. So which one of these is not a scope of work element for a planning application? All right, so it looks like we've got our answer in. There's a little bit of mixed ones here, but the correct answer is developing management costs. So that is not a planning scope of work element. So it's not required to, you know, put in your scope of work for your plan about developing management costs. The rest are scope of work requirements in a hazard mitigation planning application. So it is B, developing management costs is not a scope of work for a planning element for a plan, excuse me, is not an element for a scope of work planning application. All right. All right, so now we're going to discuss the budget. So when you submit in FEMA Go, you're required to conduct, outline a budget, but you're also required to submit the SF424A, which is a budget form for non-construction projects, or non-construction programs, excuse me. So it's important that you have both. And what we do generally recommend is your SF424A also match your FEMA Go budget. So we also, when you're doing that FEMA Go budget, it should be aligning with the OMB cost categories. So here are some of the cost categories that you'll see on that SF424A, and generally we recommend separating your costs by these categories in the official system, FEMA Go. So personnel salary, personnel fringe, contractual, or consultants, that can kind of be the same idea. Supplies, equipment, travel, and then pre-award. If you have any pre-award costs, so costs that you have, you're seeking reimbursement for prior to that award. So on the right, you'll see here some suggestions from our HMA guidance for what planning costs should include. Now, we will see various levels of budgets, but these are really some items that you should think about ahead of time to make sure, if you're not including them, that they're not needed. But these are some ones that we recommend definitely looking at. So if there's any mapping software needed, if you're hiring a contractor or a consultant, are there any personnel costs, so staff time, which is, we'll go into a little bit more actually. And then meeting and public outreach, so if there's any type of material needed for those, perhaps you need to rent a location to hold a public meeting, materials and supplies, printing and advertising, equipment, travel, and project management costs. Oh God. Can everyone still hear me, Michelle? Sorry, my computer just logged me out.
I can still hear you.
Great. Well, one moment. My computer just logged. I think I need to restart my computer. I can't seem to log back in. It's logged me out and will accept my smart card.
Yeah, well, where we were, just kind of going through here on the right in the box in blue, just kind of walking through some of those costs that we would anticipate seeing in a planning sub-application. So we're talking through a little bit about the software, if there's any meetings or public outreach needed. Certainly sometimes we see costs associated with running a space to hold a meeting, so that's something that could be included in the budget. If there's any materials or supplies that are needed for printing out materials, doing part of that public outreach and advertisement, all those costs could be associated and included in the budget. Equipment, if there's any equipment that are needed as part of the planning development and part of those meetings, et cetera, that's certainly something to include in the budget. There is a threshold for equipment, so just making sure to be aware that when you are putting the budget together, there's a $5,000 minimum for that equipment line item, so just kind of being aware of that. And then if there's any travel associated with the planning sub-application, going to the meetings as part of the individuals that are going to be putting together. If the planning committee, the planning team needs to travel, those items can certainly be included as well. And then project management costs, as the name suggests, those costs can be included. And then just wanted to make a little bit of a note there that is different from management costs. So I believe Brenna mentioned that earlier in regards to management costs are those administrative and indirect costs associated with the overarching grant. So that's a little bit separate from that project management. So just making sure when you are putting your budget together, just to look at in the NOFO, which describes management costs and what's defined as management and how that will differ from the project. So again, the management costs are the administrative and indirect associated with the overarching grant. And then the pre-award costs, those items, as you can see here bolded in red or in highlight on the left, those do need to be entered as a separate cost line item in FEMA Go budget. And actually will prompt you to enter it as a pre-award cost. So when you're going through your budget, if anything is pre-award, it's occurred as part of that development. And I can pull up the definition here, or maybe Ravi, you can drop the definition of what constitutes a pre-award in the chat. Just making sure it falls within the time period that's aligned with the definition of what constitutes a pre-award, and then when you put it into FEMA Go, you click it as a pre-award cost. So we can make sure when we're reviewing that it's appropriately categorized and taken care of for that as well. So your budget, you just want to be as detailed as possible and making sure to include any anticipated costs that you would need associated with doing this plan update or new plan or any sort of planning related activities. Next slide. Great. So we have the definition here for pre-award, so I was ahead of myself on that one. So pre-award costs, as you can see here, are defined directly related to developing the BRIC grant application or sub-application, and that are incurred prior to the date of the grant award. So we have a couple examples up here, and I'll walk through those here in a second. But as I noted, they should be requested in your application as a cost line item. You want to make sure you're clearly categorizing any of those costs that are pre-award in FEMA Go budget. And they can't be actually any costs that are associated with doing actual implementation of the work. So, for example, starting the risk assessment for your plan or actually writing your plan. Any of those elements which would be the actual implementation. So they have to be those costs that are occurring to developing the BRIC grant application or sub-application, not actually doing the implementation of the work itself. So some examples of what can constitute as a pre-award cost. It's writing the sub-grant application. Some of those meetings that might be occurring with staff prior to, putting forward the BRIC grant sub-application. It can be the application development and submission of HMA sub-applications, or any kind of travel and attendance located or associated with some workshops or trainings. And someone came up with, I dropped it in the chat, someone had a question in regards to whether this training could constitute as a pre-award cost or a match, and it certainly could if it's articulated that it's directly aligned with the mitigation activities and development of a particular BRIC sub-application. So you just need to kind of have that narrative and justification available, but certainly some of these workshops and educational components could be used as pre-award match or pre-award costs. And then the last thing I just wanted to flag, is, which is why it's important to note, if it's a pre-award, it's not necessarily guaranteed. It's only funded if the grant is selected and funded. So just want to make sure that's flagged. Any pre-award costs that you put in the application are only funded if the grant is selected and funded. But they're really helpful, so you can kind of look more into regards to what is some other examples of pre-award costs. We do outline some of that in the NOFO as well, so certainly encourage you to take a look at that. Next slide. So here's one of the budget examples from FEMA Go. So if you're not familiar with FEMA Go, it is a new system as of last year under the BRIC fiscal year 2020. We have a lot of great webinars on FEMA Go. So if you are not familiar with that, certainly encourage you to check some of those online. We have a YouTube channel for FEMA, and there's some tutorials listed there for FEMA Go, and we can drop those in the chat as well. But again, this is an example of a non-construction budget, which breaks down what we kind of mentioned, Brenna mentioned in regards to some of the costs that we would see associated typically with a planning sub-application. So as you can see here on the screen, when you go into FEMA Go, it would look like this screenshot here, and you have a breakdown of the salaries that would be associated with, or the personnel that would be associated with, maybe this is a planning team, and who will be part of this planning sub-application. Then you also have broken down between the salaries as well as the benefits or the fringe, and so how that is broken out. And you also would see here listed kind of if you're contracting anybody out. In this case, they were contracting out for doing the work associated with a risk assessment. So here you see that some associated with that. And then community meetings, public outreach, and supplies. So a lot of, again, this going back to some of the typical cost line items we would see associated with a planning sub-application. And then each of these would be broken out in a little bit more detail. So for example here, you see this box. So if you would kind of look into FEMA Go, anytime you have a cost line item, it would then be opened up and you would provide more details. So in this case here, it shows the community meetings line item we saw on the previous screen. And then when we open up the application in FEMA Go, each of these would be broken down into more detail. So we would see kind of the quantity, the unit of measure, the unit price. This kind of gives us, as we review, and also the individual or team that's submitting the application, that detail and that we would need to kind of see how did this cost item, where was this funding figure derived from? So it really kind of helps break that down in a little bit more detail so we can see where this, for example, this one, the community meetings, the $5,004, and how did that arrive at that cost? And we can see here it was 3 meetings, and each of those meetings will cost roughly $1,600 $1,668, and which is where we got that total. And this would typically always align back to your scope of work and work schedule. So if we would go back to the scope of work and work schedule, we'd see there would be 3 meetings occurring, and this all kind of ties together. So a lot of these, the budget will be speaking and reflective of that scope of work. So we'll see a lot of those tie-ins there. A couple of reminders is just that please always be sure to include a line item breakdown of all anticipated costs. Details are fantastic. It's great. It helps us kind of tie together that scope of work and work schedule. And then really importantly, again, if anything's a pre-award cost, making sure to note that so we can ensure that kind of gets processed in that manner. And then you can see here in the box, in FEMA Go, there'll be a area where you can check if it is a pre-award. So it'll automatically label it in the budget for you. Okay, next slide, please. So budget narrative. So what is required is part of your planning sub-application submission. You would put forward that details in the FEMA Go budget cost estimate area. But one thing in addition to that FEMA Go budget is to provide any supporting budget documentation as an attachment. So this could be a narrative, so a budget narrative that's broken down in a Word document, or it could be an Excel sheet that gives a more detailed more details on what was submitted in the FEMA Go budget. And it just really helps describe or provide context to each line item, or if there's any sources on how those estimated costs were derived from. So example, a lot of times we'll see quotes or estimates that were submitted or used to kind of build out that budget. They're provided as attachments. And again, this helps us as reviewers on FEMA Go side really kind of understand the budget and what's being submitted and how that ties back to that scope of work and as well as work schedule. One thing I would note about that is just kind of below here is what's helpful is to really describe how that budget relates back to implementing the scope of work. So again, it just helps us have that context to how and what each line item means. And then it just describes, again, that who, what, why, and how. So really it's breaking down any lump sum costs. And one thing that's important to note is that lump sum costs are ineligible. So if it's just a large lump sum and the budget with none of those supporting details, that's something we would kind of come back to ask, you know, hey, can we provide a little bit more context on how this was derived and what's it based off of? So then we can kind of pull together the eligibility and reasonableness of the cost estimate. So again, just as I think one thing that's just to kind of keep in mind as you build out that cost estimate in the FEMA Go system, any supporting documentation that you have or sources of information that helped you build out that estimated cost estimate, just provide those as attachments and we'll make sure to have those on our end as well. Next slide. And I'm going to put a pause here before I talk too much longer, is seeing if Brenda was able to connect back in. If not, I'll keep going. Narrative that we might see, it's really just a snapshot. It's not the full budget narrative, but it's an example we saw, I think a couple of years back, and it's a good, really just broke down each kind of cost estimate line item we would have seen in the submission of this FEMA Go. In this case, this was eGrants, our previous system. But it broke down each cost line item to say, okay, this was the total amount that you saw in the application, and here's a little bit more context of how that number funding figure was pulled together. So for example, the pre-application development was a cost line item, and in the budget narrative, it just provided a little bit more context in regards to how that number was derived. So here it shows that this cost covered the county manager's time to develop the plan. It was roughly about 20 hours at excuse me, 20 hours at $20 an hour, and it included fringes. So roughly the estimate was around $400. And then you can kind of see each of these bullet points. It breaks it down in a little bit more detail again. So for one of the cost line items that was in a budget, it was a contracted plan development. And in the budget narrative you see here, they explained a little bit more in detail how that number came to be, that funding figure. And here it was, these costs will cover the contracted firm to oversee the plan development per the submitted scope of work. So tying everything together, and then also flagging that there's an attached quote or estimate. So it's a way that we can just kind of look to see, okay, where do these pieces all fit together here? And then just kind of the grant administration and distribution. That's similar to what we see above. It's really just breaking it down a little bit more. Who's responsible for that work task, and that goes back to the work schedule. So they're speaking to one another. So it's sharing who is responsible for it, what this is going to cover, and then how is it covering it. So you can see here the amount of hours, the salary and fringes that were included in that estimate and how that was derived. So it's really kind of breaking it down, and it's linking back to that who, what, and how. So it gives us all the context that's needed. Next slide, please. So management costs, I mentioned that earlier, so just kind of linking back to that for a second. So that is distinctively different from the project management. So management costs, again, are the indirect costs and administrative expenses administering an award or sub-award. So it's responsible for kind of that overarching component, whereas project is really directly aligned to the project itself. Per the guidance in the NOFO, so if you do, I recommend if you're interested to include management costs in your sub-application or at an application level, is just take a look at the Notice of Funding Opportunity, the one that was released recently in August for fiscal year 2021. And it really breaks down what constitutes the management costs and what are some examples. And then one thing it also flags is that any indirect costs, those are only available as management costs. So they would be included in your management costs, sub-application, or application. If you are interested to submit for management costs or indirect costs, there's two ways to do that. So you can either submit it as a separate application, and that would be its own sub-application. And if you do that, that's 10% of the total grant application budget. So again, this must be a separate management cost sub-application, and that's what we recommend because you get that 10%, you get that larger percentage there. You can also submit for management costs within an actual planning or project sub-application itself, and if you do that, it would be just its own cost line item in the budget in FEMA Go, and it's 5% of the project or planning sub-application budget. So again, there's two ways to do it. You can either include that as part of your planning sub-application budget as its own cost item, or you can do it as a separate sub-application, and that would be the 10% of the total grant application budget. And then if you can go back one, if you are requesting a management cost, just want to flag any indirect costs, you would also need to include the tribe's negotiated indirect cost rate agreement in application. So please be sure that's uploaded into FEMA Go with your application as well. Next slide. And just some examples of management costs we have here up on the screen. It's the financial management of the planning project. It could be processing vendor invoices. It could be that larger component of managing the grant, such as drawing down reimbursement funding from the FEMA's PAR system, which is the financial system. It could be, again, some of the larger components of managing the grant writ large, such as preparing, submitting quarterly reports, so doing that ongoing monitoring throughout the award. And then again, any indirect costs or partially indirect costs would be examples of management costs. And Brenna, I know you're able or online, so this might be a good one too if you want to flag any other examples of management costs, because we do tend to get a lot of questions around these.
Thanks, Kayla. Sorry, everyone, for that. Yes, I am back. My computer must be ready for me again. These are really more these are really more of the common management costs that we see. We do get a lot of indirect cost questions. And management costs, whether you're doing a separate management cost sub-application or including management costs in your sub-application itself, it's really important to note those percentages. So 5% in an application, and then 10% as its own sub-application for management costs. And I know we discussed this in the last webinar, but for BRIC this year, you can receive both sub-applicant management costs, so that 5%, and 10% as a separate management cost sub-application. So it's really more advantageous to receive both of them. So if you want to do that, you definitely want to include that up to 5% in your planning application and then your separate management cost application.
Hey, Brenna, one thing I was just thinking about mentioning too is if you do the full 10% sub-application, what's that split between the federal and non-federal share?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Kayla. Management costs are paid at 100% federal share. So that is relatively new with BRIC. So that is covered by the federal share. So that would be 100% federally funded. Yeah. And all right, well, I'll kind of take over now. Let's go over to our next slide, our knowledge check. All right. So on your screen, you'll see here what is required to, as part of your budget and financial commitment. So let's see, we have A, a detailed cost estimate, B, supporting budget narrative, C, a separate management cost application, or D, a match funds letter. So which is required as part of your budget and financial commitment? So choose which one that you believe is correct. We'll give a few more seconds here to get some final answers in. All right, let's get our last answers in and wrapped up. All right, so what is required as part of your budget and financial commitment? So that would be a match funds commitment letter. We do want to see a detailed cost estimate as part of your application, right? So your application would have a cost estimate that shows how you've arrived at that, or a budget narrative. But what is required, we do require a match funds commitment letter to make sure that the responsible entity, the tribal council, the tribal government, president, executive has authorized that amount of funding. All right, next slide. Key reminders. Next slide. And I am going to pass this over to Kyle for a couple slides.
Sure, thanks, Brenna. So hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I did just want to go through a couple key reminders here for the hazard mitigation planning process. So remember, the hazard mitigation planning process is a kind of a structured process to baseline what risks are within your community and what you want to do to reduce those risks within your community. And so within the plan, there's documentation of the process that was actually taken to develop the plan. And this will include things like which partners were at the table. It will also include how the community was engaged throughout the planning process, whether that was through surveys, things like Facebook, or other types of online engagement with the public, and also their feedback into the plan. And so that the planning process will identify what the planning process that was actually taken, and it will be documented within the plan so that you can understand how decisions were made. Within the plan, you'll also see a hazard risk assessment and a hazard identification. And this is really where The plan will identify the locations of known hazards within your area, such as floods, wildfires, earthquakes, drought, coastal erosion. So there will be a detailed risk assessment of those hazards, where they occur, and how your community assets are vulnerable to those hazards will be identified within the mitigation plan. And from that risk assessment and through that public engagement, you'll also be developing a mitigation strategy within the mitigation plan. This is really the heart of the mitigation plan. It's kind of like the wish list of what you want to accomplish over the next 5, 10, 20 years for reducing your overall exposure to those hazards that you identified in the risk assessment. And this could be, for flood, you could be identifying, specific structures that you want to elevate outside of the floodplain, or even that you want to relocate to outside of the floodplain. It could be earthquake retrofits. You may have important structures like city halls or other community centers that are potentially unreinforced masonry that you may want to retrofit to be stronger to potential earthquake hazard, or things like wildfire mitigation, doing defensible space around your critical infrastructure. And so those will be within the mitigation strategy of the mitigation plan. And there's also, part of that process is we conduct a plan review at the FEMA level to make sure that you're meeting those minimum requirements. And then also, one of the things within the plan is you'll actually have a, kind of a process for keeping track and evaluating the progress of how you're doing with implementing the plan, just so that you can make sure you're keeping track of those goals and meeting your established objectives. And so the other thing that's part of that process is once you've completed the plan, the written plan, you'll actually take that to your tribal leadership and have that adopted by the plan. And that's kind of the final step of that planning process before you start implementing it. And an important note here is that HMA funds cannot fund the analysis of human-caused hazards. They can be included in your plan, but it needs to be clear in that scope of work that the grant will not be paying for that portion. And so again, just remember that the focus of these hazard mitigation plans are for natural hazards, and that's what the grant scope of work should call out. Next slide, please. All right, and so the hazard mitigation plan approval timeframe. Your hazard mitigation plan, it must be approved by FEMA and adopted by your tribe or village, usually by some type of council resolution within that period of performance of the grant. And again, it's really important to remember here to leave at least, that 6-month timeline within your project timeline to allow for that process of both FEMA review and approval and adoption by your tribal leaders. It's important to remember this just because when you do submit your plan to FEMA for formal review and approval, there's always the opportunity or the chance that there might be required revisions where it goes through a couple different times where you have to update sections of the plan to make sure that they meet those minimum requirements. FEMA will only approve a plan once the mitigation plan has met all those requirements within the Code of Federal Regulations. And so just make sure that you're aware of those minimum requirements, especially as you start building out your scope for how you want to build your plan. Next slide. And again, so why conduct hazard mitigation plan? There are many different benefits from going through this planning process. And through the process, you're really able to identify actions that will prevent damage from hazards before that hazard occurs, really lessen the impact that a disaster can have on your community. And so instead of that repeated damage and repairing things after each disaster, it's way more cost effective to implement actions before a disaster occurs so that you can have benefits year after year. And last, but definitely not least here, is that a plan is required in order to apply and be eligible for BRIC and HMGP project funding. And then with that, I will pass it back to you, Brenna.
Thanks, Kyle. All right, so one of the questions that we get here a lot is you know, kind of what's behind the scenes for a BRIC application. You know, you submit your application, you can't always see what goes on. So here's kind of the life cycle breakdown. So first we have that notice of funding opportunity, right? That's going to be released yearly. So this year it was released in summer of 2021, and it was released just last month. The application period is going to open on the 30th, right? September 30th, so next week. And then the submission deadline for applications is January 28th, 2022 at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. We really recommend submitting 2 weeks prior though, just because like any system that's accepting anything on a national scale, you know, it could just help prevent any delays, or maybe if the system gets bogged down, as we all dealt with today, the bandwidth issues, so to try to prevent those. So we really recommend submitting 2 weeks early. And then selections, so that's when these selections will post to FEMA.gov from our headquarters. This is when you receive the selection and pre-award selection notice, so it'll be posted there on FEMA.gov. This is generally a summer of 2022 timeframe. As we get closer, we'll maybe have a little bit more accurate month estimate, but we generally say summer of 2022. And then the grant award. So the grant award that we make that estimate of December of 2022 and after. And the reason why we say after is it really depends on what type of application it is, as well as how many we get regionally. Because we do have a limited staff. If we get, you know, hundreds, it's going to take longer than if we get a few dozen. And it also depends with that EHP, the Environmental and Historic Preservation Review, because let's say you have a complicated project that is in a historic area, or perhaps is in an area with endangered animals like salmon. This could take a bit longer because of that environmental review. And so that's why we like to say December 2022 and after. And it also depends how complete your application is. For example, if we have to go back and forth a lot for after selections in what's called our RFI, request for information, to finish your application to make sure it meets our program requirements. This could be anything from questions about some budget information, perhaps if forms are missing. So it depends also if the application is really well put together and it's ready for award once we receive it, or if we have to go back and forth quite a few times. So we really like to just say generally December 2022 and after. And the periods of performance. So that is, you know, the grant is given a period of performance, so that is 36 months. So what that is when you accept that as a recipient, the grant award, that is the first day of the award, and then the end date is 36 months from that date. So let's say, you know, it's September 1st, 2022. It could, you know, it would be 3 years, 36 months from that date. And then that closeout. So after that 3 years period of performance is over, your closeout is due within 90 days of that period of performance. So we generally like to discuss that as well, because closeouts there is some information required when you close out a grant, and there's more information in the HMA guidance if you're interested, but that is, the closeout period is 90 days after that period of performance, and that is when the final closeout material is due. Next slide. All right, so here's some key application deadline reminders. Again, January 28th of 2022 at 3 p.m. Eastern. And we really recommend submitting that 2 weeks early just in case, you know, with those bandwidth issues we had today. Think of that as on a national scale. And then also, all grants and some grant applications, they're required to be submitted to the FEMA Go system at that link. Next slide. All right, so we'll talk about some resources out there now. All right, so we have some planning resources here, which are the Tribal Planning Handbook, the Tribal Mitigation Planning Review Guide, and those are both great documents as you look forward planning to write a hazard mitigation plan, or perhaps updating your plan and writing an application for funding for that. Mitigation ideas. This is a document that walks through whole bunch of various mitigation actions. So I like to think of it kind of helps get those, you know, light bulbs starting in your head for items in your community and projects in your community that can help build your resilience. And then here is a list of our tribal liaisons. This is a link. We do have our tribal liaisons here in FEMA Region 10 at the end, but if you perhaps are from another FEMA region, this is where you can find links to their contact information. And then also just the general FEMA mitigation planning website at the bottom. Next slide. All right, so FEMA Go, it's really important if you're not registered in FEMA Go and you are interested in applying for BRIC, that's the first step you can do today, is go to this link and check out the FEMA Go resources and how to register. There's also a FEMA Go help desk contact right there on your screen or phone number, but it's really the first action. If you're interested in applying for BRIC, you want to make sure that you're taking is that your tribe is registered in FEMA Go so you can start working on your application. Next slide. All right, so for program resources for BRIC, here on your screen we have just the general BRIC website, some key information about before you apply for BRIC, as well as resources in general for the program. That link also has what's called program support materials, which it walks through a whole bunch of great information. So we really recommend checking that out. For example, there is information on planning subgrants, there's information on criteria for projects submitted to the national competition. So it's really important to check those out because any questions you might have might be answered in those. And then here for the BRIC webinars are our national BRIC webinars being hosted. They started last month, but they're also currently being hosted. So if you're interested in attending those or watching a recording, they're available there. As well as down here is the link to our hazard mitigation assistance guide. This is really important because this is basically our main guidance document that we look at on our side. So it's a great resource for you to look at ahead of time to see how your application is fitting those requirements, because when we get our applications and we work through them to make sure we can award them, this is what we're referring to for our requirements. So you can get ahead of the curve and make sure your applications meet everything. And then lastly here you can see the Tribal Mitigation Planning Handbook, which we mentioned also on the last screen. I guess not lastly, so here's our very last point here too, is our Region 10 webinars. If you're here today, you probably know how to find it, but please feel free to share this with anyone you find who may be interested in attending. And then today, we were doing our capability and capacity building planning application development, but next week we have our project scoping application development. So that is next Thursday on September 30th. So same time and place. This again will be recorded if you're not available to attend, but we really look forward to giving the rest of these webinar series. And please do come with your questions if you have any, and we're happy to answer them. Next slide. All right, so here's the mysterious faces behind the work. I know sometimes we all have to work in this this digital environment, and it can be, kind of impersonal. So these are the people on our team here for our non-disaster grants. We have Rob on the far left, Cindy or Cynthia, myself in the middle, Kayla, and Robbie. And we are all the ones who are working on our program. And when you send an email to this general email inbox with a question, these are the live people behind it. We all monitor it and respond to those emails. So it's one of us who is responding to you. Next slide. And then here are our tribal liaisons for FEMA Region 10. As you can see, Aaron, Aurora, and Jay on the left, they work in our lower 3 states, Washington, Idaho, and Oregon. And then Ramona works specifically in Alaska and with our Alaska tribes and native villages. And she is just right there on the right. So that's their contact as well if you would like to reach out for them. And they're a great resource to help connect you with the right resource. So if, for example, you're interested in mitigation, but maybe this presentation isn't exactly what you're looking for. You're actually looking for maybe more information on another program. They are the ones that can help make that connection for you and get you in touch with the right person. Next slide.